Close your eyes and get comfortable. Tonight, we are traveling back in time, back to a city that began as a small collection of mud huts on 7 hills beside a river in central Italy. A city that would grow over the course of 1,000 years to become the most powerful civilization the Western world had ever seen. We are going to follow the story of Rome from its very beginning, from the mythological founding by 2 brothers raised by a wolf, through the centuries of kings and senators and generals and emperors, through the wars and the triumphs, and the slow, quiet unraveling of something that once seemed like it would last forever. There is no rush tonight. We have all the time in the world. Let the story carry you. The year is 753 BC. Italy is a land of rolling hills and dense forests, and wide rivers that flood their banks every spring. The peninsula stretches down into the Mediterranean Sea like a boot kicking at the island of Sicily. Along the western coast, a river called the Tiber winds slowly through a flat plain dotted with marshes and clusters of low hills. On 7 of those hills, a small community of people has made their home. They are Latin-speaking farmers and shepherds. They keep cattle and grow grain in the fertile soil of the river plain. They bury their dead in the marshy ground between the hills. They speak a language that will one day become Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian. But right now, it is simply the language of their small village on the Tiber. The Romans themselves told a different story about where they came from. They said their city was founded by a man named Romulus, and that Romulus and his twin brother Remus were the sons of the god Mars himself. Their mother was a priestess named Rhea Silvia, and when her uncle the king discovered she had given birth, he ordered the babies thrown into the Tiber River to drown. But the servant tasked with drowning them could not bring himself to do it. He placed the twins in a basket and set them on the river instead. The basket drifted downstream and came to rest at the foot of a hill called the Palatine. The babies cried in the mud at the river's edge, and, according to the story, a wolf heard them crying and came to investigate. Instead of eating them, she lay down beside them and nursed them as if they were her own cubs. A shepherd named Faustulus eventually found the boys. He took them home and raised them as his own sons. When Romulus and Remus grew up, they discovered who they were. They killed their uncle the king. They freed their mother. And then they went back to the Tiber, back to the 7 hills where the wolf had nursed them, to found a new city. The trouble was, they could not agree on which hill to build it on. Romulus wanted the Palatine hill. Remus preferred the Aventine. They decided to settle the argument by watching the sky for omens. Whichever brother saw more vultures flying overhead would choose the site. Remus saw 6 vultures. He declared himself the winner. Then Romulus saw 12. He declared himself the winner instead. The argument turned violent. In the fight that followed, Romulus killed his own twin brother. He built his city on the Palatine hill. He named it Roma after himself. He declared himself its first king. The year, according to Roman tradition, was 753 BC. Now, whether any of that story is literally true is a question historians have debated for centuries. What we know is that archaeological evidence does confirm a settlement on the Palatine Hill dating to roughly the 8th century BC. People did live there. A community did exist. Whether a wolf was involved is another matter. What matters is that the Romans believed this story completely. They were proud of it. The wolf nursing the founders became one of the most enduring symbols of Rome. You can still see it today in sculptures and coins and paintings scattered across the ruins of the ancient city. Rome began with an act of violence between 2 brothers. It would not be the last. After Romulus, the tradition says Rome had 6 more kings. 7 kings total, ruling the city for nearly 2.5 centuries. Some of these kings were wise, and some were cruel, and some were both. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, built the first bridge across the Tiber. He founded the port city of Ostia at the river's mouth, giving Rome its first access to maritime trade. The fifth king, Tarquinius Priscus, was an Etruscan, from the sophisticated civilization that dominated central Italy north of Rome. He brought Etruscan culture and engineering to Rome. Under his rule, the great marsh between the hills was drained by an enormous sewer called the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, parts of which still function today beneath the streets of modern Rome. He also began construction of a great temple on the Capitoline Hill, dedicated to Jupiter, the king of the gods. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, reorganized Roman society. He conducted the first census, counting the population and sorting citizens by wealth into voting classes. He built a great defensive wall around the city. Stretches of that wall still stand in Rome today, near the central train station. And then came the seventh king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was cruel and arrogant, and he ruled by fear. He executed senators without trial. He ignored the traditional councils that had advised previous kings. He treated the Roman people not as citizens to be governed, but as subjects to be controlled. The Romans endured him for years, and then, in 509 BC, they had enough. A group of Roman nobles led a revolt. Tarquin the Proud was driven from the city. He spent the rest of his life trying to reclaim his throne through military alliances with neighboring kings. He never succeeded. Rome declared that it would never again be ruled by a king. Instead, it would govern itself. The Republic was born. The Roman Republic was one of the most remarkable experiments in government the ancient world ever produced. Power was divided, shared, checked and balanced in ways that were genuinely revolutionary for their time. At the top were 2 consuls, elected every year by the citizen assembly. They held the executive power of the old kings, but only for 12 months. Each consul could veto the decisions of the other. No single man could dominate. Below the consuls were other elected magistrates, the praetors, who administered justice, the censors, who conducted the census and monitored public morality, the quaestors, who managed finances, and above all of them, in theory, was the Senate. The Senate was an assembly of several hundred men drawn from the elite families of Rome. Senators served for life. They debated and advised, and in practice, wielded enormous influence over Roman policy. The word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. It was a government built on tradition and precedent and the wisdom of experience. It was conservative almost by definition. Change came slowly, if it came at all. This was both the great strength and the great weakness of the Republic. Roman society was divided sharply between 2 groups. The patricians were the old aristocratic families. They claimed descent from the original followers of Romulus. They dominated the Senate. For centuries, they held a near monopoly on political and religious office. The plebeians were everyone else: farmers and craftsmen and merchants and soldiers, the vast majority of the population. For much of the early Republic, they had little political power and no way to challenge the patricians who controlled their lives. But the plebeians had one weapon: they could leave. On several occasions in the early Republic, the plebeians staged what the Romans called a secessio, a withdrawal. They simply walked out of Rome en masse and camped on a hill outside the city, threatening to found a new city of their own unless their grievances were addressed. It worked. Over the course of 2 centuries, the plebeians won a series of concessions. Their own elected representatives, called tribunes, who had the power to veto any action that harmed plebeian citizens, access to the consulship, and, critically, the publication of Roman law on 12 bronze tablets in the middle of the Forum, so that everyone could read exactly what the law said, rather than having to trust patrician judges to interpret it fairly. The 12 tables were posted around 450 BC. They were not a perfect law code. They reflected the inequalities of their time. But the principle that the law should be written down and publicly available so that all citizens could know their rights, that principle was genuinely radical. Its influence echoes through every legal system in the Western world today. Rome spent the first 2 centuries of the Republic fighting. There was almost always a war somewhere, against neighboring Latin tribes, against the Etruscans to the north, against the Samnite hill tribes of central Italy, against the Greek colonies of southern Italy. Slowly, steadily, the circle of Roman control expanded. By 270 BC, Rome controlled virtually the entire Italian peninsula. Then came Carthage. Carthage was a great city on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Tunisia. It had been founded by Phoenician traders from the eastern Mediterranean centuries earlier, and had grown into a maritime empire controlling trade across the western Mediterranean. Its navy was the most powerful in the world. Its wealth was enormous. Rome and Carthage were the 2 dominant powers in the western Mediterranean, and eventually they were going to collide. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over the island of Sicily. It lasted 23 years. It was fought largely at sea, which meant Rome had to build a navy from almost nothing. The Romans were not natural sailors, but they were extraordinary engineers, and they were willing to learn. They won. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. Peace lasted less than 2 decades. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC, and it produced one of the most remarkable military campaigns in all of ancient history. Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general of extraordinary talent. His father had made him swear as a child that he would be Rome's eternal enemy. He kept that oath with spectacular dedication. He marched an army from Spain across southern Gaul to the Alps. Then he crossed the Alps in winter, with elephants. The logistics of this achievement are staggering even by modern standards. He led somewhere between 40 and 90,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants across some of the most brutal mountain terrain in Europe in the middle of winter. The cold killed thousands of men and most of the elephants. By the time he descended into northern Italy, his army was badly depleted. It did not matter. He crushed every Roman army sent against him. At the Battle of Trebia in 218 BC, he destroyed a Roman force of 40,000 men. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he ambushed an entire Roman army in fog along a lakeshore, killing 15,000 and capturing 6,000 more. And then came Cannae. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC is still studied in military academies around the world. Hannibal faced a Roman army of perhaps 80,000 men, the largest Rome had ever assembled. He was outnumbered. His center was deliberately weak. As the Romans pushed forward against his weak center, his stronger flanks folded inward, encircling the entire Roman army. By the end of the day, between 50 and 70,000 Romans were dead. It was one of the worst single-day defeats in military history. Rome should have collapsed. It did not. The Romans refused to negotiate. They refused to surrender. They raised new armies. They changed their strategy. Instead of meeting Hannibal in open battle, they avoided him. They cut off his supplies. They took back his allied cities one by one. They carried the war to Africa itself. Hannibal was recalled home to defend Carthage. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, the Roman general Scipio, later called Africanus for this victory, defeated Hannibal in the open field. It was the first time Hannibal had ever lost a pitched battle. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had survived something that should have destroyed it. What does not kill you makes you an empire. Rome spent the next century expanding relentlessly. Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, Spain, southern Gaul. The Mediterranean was becoming a Roman lake. But the expansion created problems at home. The endless wars required soldiers. Soldiers came mostly from the class of small farmers who owned enough land to afford their own equipment. While they were away fighting, their farms fell into debt. Their land was bought up by wealthy aristocrats who worked it with slaves captured in the same wars the farmers had been fighting. The small farmers came home to find themselves dispossessed. They drifted into Rome. They swelled the city's population. They had no land and no stable income, but they had votes. Politicians began to compete for those votes with promises of land reform and grain distributions. The traditional aristocracy of the Senate resisted every reform as a threat to their power and property. The Republic began to tear itself apart. Two brothers named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried in the 130s and 120s BC to push through land reform legislation that would redistribute public land to the poor. Both were killed by political opponents, murdered in the streets of Rome by men who claimed to be defending the Republic. The precedent was catastrophic. Political violence had entered Roman public life. Over the following decades, generals used their armies as personal political tools. Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself, twice. Civil wars became a recurring feature of Roman politics. The Republic's institutions were designed for a city-state. They were straining under the weight of a Mediterranean empire. And then came Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was born around 100 BC into a patrician family of modest means but ancient name. He was brilliant and ambitious and charming and utterly ruthless. He understood that the path to power in the late Republic ran through military glory and popular support. He spent 9 years in Gaul, the region that is now France and Belgium and parts of Germany, conquering tribe after tribe in campaigns of extraordinary military genius. His account of those campaigns, the Gallic Wars, is still read today both as a military history and as a masterwork of Latin prose. He was also honest about what he was doing. He killed approximately 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million in the course of those 9 years. He wrote about it plainly in his dispatches to Rome. His enemies in the Senate feared him. They ordered him to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would have left him vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies. In January of 49 BC, Caesar stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law forbade a general from crossing into Italy with his army. He crossed anyway. Alea iacta est, he reportedly said. The die is cast. Civil war followed. Caesar's opponents, including his former ally Pompey, fled to Greece. Caesar pursued them. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, he crushed Pompey's much larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, and was murdered on the beach as he stepped ashore. Caesar arrived in Egypt. He met Cleopatra. He became entangled in Egyptian politics for over a year. He fathered a son. Eventually, he returned to Rome. He was appointed dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, for life. It was the thing the Republic had been designed to prevent. One man holding supreme power indefinitely. A group of senators, 60 of them by some accounts, decided the Republic had to be saved, even if it meant killing the man who had ended it. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, they surrounded Caesar in the theater of Pompey during a Senate meeting. Each man stabbed him once, 23 wounds in total. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. The senators had saved the Republic, or so they thought. What followed was another round of civil wars, more brutal than anything before. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, and his lieutenant, Mark Antony, destroyed the assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Then Octavian and Antony fought each other. Antony allied himself with Cleopatra. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's fleet destroyed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Both of them died by suicide within the year. Octavian stood alone. He was the last man standing after a century of Roman civil wars. He was very careful about what he did next. Octavian knew that Caesar had been killed for being too obvious about his power. He would not make the same mistake. He did not call himself king. He did not call himself dictator. He kept all the old republican institutions, the Senate, the consuls, the elections. He simply made sure that in every meaningful way, all real power flowed through him. He called himself princeps, first citizen, first among equals. The Senate gave him a new honorific name, Augustus, the revered one. History knows him as Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. He ruled for 41 years, from 27 BC to 14 AD. It was the longest reign of any Roman emperor, and arguably the most consequential. He reorganized the army. He reformed the tax system. He rebuilt Rome in marble. He boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He established the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, that would, over the following centuries, become a king-making power in its own right. He also closed the gates of the Temple of Janus. In Roman tradition, the gates of the Janus Temple were opened in times of war and closed in times of peace. In the 7 centuries of Rome's existence before Augustus, the gates had been closed only twice. Augustus closed them 3 times. After a century of civil war, Rome was at peace. The period that followed is called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. From roughly 27 BC to 180 AD, over 200 years, the Roman Empire experienced a level of stability and prosperity that the Western world would not see again for over a millennium. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. It contained somewhere between 50 and 90 million people, perhaps a quarter of the entire human population of the earth. Within this empire, a merchant could travel from London to Jerusalem on well-maintained Roman roads without crossing a foreign border. A letter written in Rome would be delivered to Alexandria in Egypt within 2 weeks by the imperial postal system. A soldier stationed on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain could eat fish sauce made in Spain and olive oil from Tunisia. The Romans built aqueducts that carried fresh water to cities across the empire. Some of those aqueducts still carry water today. They built roads so precisely engineered that many of them remain visible in the landscape of Europe 2,000 years later. They built amphitheaters and temples and bathhouses and sewers and harbors and bridges across the known world. They also built a remarkably consistent legal system that applied to every citizen of the empire, regardless of where they lived or what language they spoke. The concept of Roman citizenship was enormously powerful. It meant something concrete in terms of legal rights and protections. In 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla extended Roman citizenship to virtually every free person in the empire. For one extraordinary moment, tens of millions of people across 3 continents were all citizens of the same state, governed by the same law. But let us not idealize it too much. The Roman Empire was built on slavery. Estimates suggest that at any given moment in the imperial period, somewhere between 10 and 30% of the population of Italy was enslaved. The slave trade was one of the largest industries in the Roman economy. Gladiatorial combat, men forced to fight and die for the entertainment of crowds, was not an occasional spectacle, but a regular feature of Roman public life. The provinces were governed with varying degrees of competence and compassion. Taxation could be crushing. Local cultures were sometimes suppressed. The Pax Romana was real, but it was a peace maintained by force, and its benefits were distributed very unequally. Several emperors stand out from the long parade of the first 2 centuries. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD. He was the great villain of the early empire, or at least that is how history has remembered him. In the year 64 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome that burned for 6 days, destroying much of the city. Nero was accused of starting it deliberately to clear land for a new palace. The story that he fiddled while Rome burned is almost certainly false. The fiddle was not invented for another 1,500 years, and accounts from the time actually suggest he organized relief efforts. But the image of the depraved emperor playing music while his city burned proved irresistible. What is certainly true is that Nero blamed the fire on a small religious sect called the Christians and persecuted them savagely. The apostles Peter and Paul were both executed in Rome during his reign. In 79 AD, under the Emperor Vespasian's son Titus, a catastrophe struck that had nothing to do with human affairs. Mount Vesuvius erupted. The city of Pompeii, a prosperous Roman town of about 11,000 people on the Bay of Naples, was buried under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic ash and pumice within 2 days. The city was so completely buried that it was essentially forgotten until its rediscovery in the 18th century. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii in the 19th century, they found something remarkable. The ash had hardened around the bodies of the dead, preserving their shapes. By pouring plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies, they created haunting, 3-dimensional casts of people in their final moments. A man shielding his face with his arm, a woman collapsed against a wall, a dog on a chain. Pompeii is frozen in a single day in the year 79 AD. You can walk its streets today and see the ruts left by Roman cartwheels worn into the stone paving. You can see the painted advertisements on the walls of businesses. You can see the graffiti left by ordinary Romans. jokes and declarations of love and political slogans scratched into plaster 2,000 years ago. The 5 emperors who ruled from 96 to 180 AD are called the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Each one adopted his successor, choosing the most capable man available rather than simply passing power to a biological son. It was perhaps the closest the Roman Empire ever came to a true meritocracy at the top. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. His campaigns in Dacia, modern Romania, and against the Parthian Empire in the east pushed Roman borders further than they had ever been. His column in Rome still stands today, recording his victories in a continuous spiral of carved relief that winds up the shaft like a stone comic strip. Hadrian pulled back. He consolidated rather than expanded. He visited nearly every province of the empire in person, traveling to Britain, where he ordered the construction of the Great Wall that still bears his name across the north of England. He was an aesthete and a philosopher, and a lover of all things Greek, who sometimes seemed more at home in Athens than in Rome. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 peaceful years, the longest peaceful reign in the history of the empire. Almost nothing dramatic happened during his time in power, which is, in its own way, remarkable. And then Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was the philosopher king that Plato had dreamed of. He had been trained in Stoic philosophy from childhood, and he took it seriously, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a daily practice. Every night before sleep, he wrote in a private journal. He wrote about his failures and his fears and his efforts to be better. He wrote about the shortness of life and the importance of virtue and the insignificance of fame. He never intended anyone to read those journals. We call them the Meditations. They have been in continuous print for nearly 2,000 years. They are as readable today as the day they were written. He wrote them while commanding armies on the Danube frontier during a brutal military campaign against the Germanic tribes that pressed constantly on Rome's northern border. He wrote about peace from the middle of a war. He died on campaign in 180 AD. He was 58 years old. With him died something of the Roman Empire's best self. The 3rd century AD was catastrophe. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had 26 emperors. Nearly all of them died violently. The empire fragmented under the pressure of military commanders who used their legions to seize power and then held it for months or years before being killed by the next ambitious general. The economy deteriorated, currency was debased, taxes rose, trade contracted. Plague swept through the empire repeatedly. The Antonine Plague, earlier in the 2nd century, had killed perhaps 5 million people, and the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century was equally devastating. On the borders, Germanic tribes pressed harder. The Sassanid Persian Empire in the east was stronger and more aggressive than the old Parthian Empire had been. The Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians in 260 AD, the only time a reigning Roman emperor was taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. He died in captivity. His image was used by Persian kings as a mounting block when they climbed on their horses. The crisis eventually passed. A series of strong soldier emperors in the late 3rd century, Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian, stabilized the empire by main force of will and reorganized it for survival. Diocletian made a fateful decision. He split the empire into 2 administrative halves, Eastern and Western, each with its own emperor. The idea was to make the vast empire more governable. It worked in the short term. In the long term, it created two Romes. Constantine. The Emperor Constantine ruled from 306 to 337 AD, and he changed the world in two ways. First, he moved the empire's capital. He founded a new city on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus Strait, where Europe meets Asia. He named it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It would be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. Second, he legalized Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Constantine himself converted to Christianity, or at least claimed to. Whether his conversion was genuine or purely political is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is the effect. Within a century, Christianity went from a persecuted minority religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire. The transformation of the Western world had begun. The western half of the empire continued to deteriorate. The Germanic tribes on the northern frontier were not a monolithic enemy. They were dozens of different peoples: Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Vandals and Franks and Burgundians and Saxons and more, with different cultures and different ambitions. Many of them had served in the Roman army for generations. They were in many ways deeply Romanized. They did not necessarily want to destroy Rome. Many of them wanted to be Rome. But the pressures pushing them across the Roman frontier were immense. From the east came the Huns, a nomadic people of extraordinary military ability who struck terror across the steppe and pushed the Germanic tribes into Roman territory in waves. In 376 AD, a huge population of Visigoths was allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory as refugees fleeing the Huns. The Roman officials tasked with feeding and settling them were corrupt. The Visigoths were starved and exploited. They revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, the Visigoths destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. It was a shock of enormous proportions. The empire struggled on. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, sacked Rome itself. The city had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological impact across the empire was profound. Saint Augustine began writing his great work, The City of God, partly in response to pagan Romans who blamed the sack on Rome's abandonment of its old gods for Christianity. Attila the Hun arrived in the 440s. He ravaged the Balkans and invaded Gaul. He was turned back at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, one of the rare times a unified Roman and Visigothic force stopped him. He invaded Italy the following year, burning cities across the Po Valley. He died suddenly in 453, possibly of a nosebleed on the night of his wedding. His empire fragmented immediately without him, but Rome was running out of time. The Western emperors in the 5th century were shadows, children or puppets controlled by Germanic generals who held the real power. On September 4th, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the Western emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy of about 15, with the bitter irony of bearing the names of both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He declared that there was no longer any need for a Western emperor. The Western Roman Empire was over. Most people who lived through it barely noticed. Life went on. The churches were still there. The laws still functioned in many places. The Latin language was still spoken. But the idea of Rome, the political institution that had endured for over 1,000 years, was finished in the West. Historians have debated the fall of Rome for centuries. Edward Gibbon spent 6 volumes on it in the 18th century. Scholars have proposed over 200 different theories. The truth is probably that there was no single cause. Military pressure from outside, economic deterioration from within, political instability at the top. The lead pipes that carried Roman drinking water, possibly a contributing factor to widespread health problems. The climate cooling slightly in the 5th century, reducing agricultural productivity. The devastating effects of repeated plague. The loss of tax revenue as provinces slipped out of imperial control. The difficulty of governing an empire of 50 million people with ancient communication technologies. Rome did not fall in a day. It declined over centuries. In some ways, it never really ended at all. It transformed into something new. Let the story of Rome settle quietly around you now. The 7 hills beside the river, the wolf and the twins, the long centuries of kings and senators and generals, the wars that built an empire and the slow unraveling that ended it, the philosophers and the tyrants, the roads and the aqueducts, and the beautiful, terrible Colosseum. All of it, rising and shining and fading and passing, as all things do. You are warm and comfortable and safe. The story has been told. Let sleep come now. Good night.